Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel, and this is Quantum Froth Dispatches. I have a little bit of housekeeping to go through. I apologize for the sporadic release of these podcasts, but I have not had access to my basement for some time, and that is where I record these. So we're going to have another break coming up as I don't have access again. And then hopefully I'll be able to get back on track with the whole 1982 movie analysis stuff. But I wanted to record this because this is the 37th anniversary, and it pains me to say this because it makes me sound really old, of a much beloved movie of mine that I used to watch as a kid. Well, I'll try to make it as dramatic as I can, you know. Before there was Labyrinth, Legend, The Never-Ending Story, The Princess Bride, and Willow, and The Lord of the Rings. But after there was Excalibur, and Star Wars, and Conan the Barbarian, and The Dark Crystal, and Clash of the Titans, and Tron, and The Lord of the Rings. There was Krull.
Skybird, this is Dropkick with a red dash alpha message in 2 parts. Break.
5, 4, 3, hands on keys, turn. If I were going to choose one word to sum up Krull, I think that word would be possibilities, or maybe potential, right? Krull was a film that was released in late July of 1983. It is a fantasy sword and sorcery adventure, you might call it, and it has achieved cult status. A lot of people adore it. I suspect modern audiences would not have the same feelings about it because they didn't grow up in that era. They didn't see it when they were kids. You know, when you're a kid, you're way more forgiving. And I just recently rewatched it. I did an episode with the folks over at Dungeon Crawlers Radio, which is a fantastic podcast if you haven't discovered it. And we were talking about Krull, and unfortunately we went really long on that, and I wasn't able to talk about a lot of the writerly things that I wanted to talk about. So I figured, well, why not do a short QFD about it? This is not going to be a deep dive. It might contain some spoilers though. So if you haven't seen Krull and you're overly concerned, about spoilers, probably don't listen to this, before seeing the film. One of the things I would recommend for folks that are interested in it is to find the novelization by Alan Dean Foster and read that instead of seeing the film first. That way you would just see the film as an adaptation of a great story instead of kind of a misfire. And there's a lot of reasons for why the film misfired. I happen to have a couple theories. I don't have any proof about this, but it should have worked. Krull has a very original setting, I would say. The story itself is not original. It's far from original. In fact, if you want to write fantasy or space opera, sword and sorcery stuff, you should immerse yourself in Krull, because if it's a trope that shows up in Krull, you might not want to reuse it. And there are 2 exceptions. There are 2 exceptions to that where I thought, man, this is just brilliant stuff. And it's really good things, and we'll talk about it. But briefly put, the plot of Krull is very linear, and you've heard it a million times. It's a young prince from one kingdom is going to marry a princess from a rival kingdom so that they can form an alliance to fight an adversary. And in this case, the adversary is actually an extraterrestrial known as the Beast. And he comes to the planet Krull in a spaceship / mountain kind of lair that is called the Black Fortress. And a really neat kind of thing is that the Black Fortress teleports at dawn to a different position on the planet. So you can't know where it's going to be. So it's pretty much impossible to attack. During their wedding, according to this ancient ritual that they're going to do, that's going to fulfill a prophecy. So yes, there is a prophecy. And during this wedding, these creatures attack that are minions of the Beast, and they kill everybody, kidnap the princess, and the leader, the hero, Colwyn, has to go on a quest to rescue the princess. Now, he's like the sole survivor of the attack, so he gets rescued or helped out by a guardian character, and it's very much, like the Gandalf, Merlin kind of archetype and everything, and that is Ynir, and he's known as the Old One, and the princess's name is Lissa, and the hero's name is Colwyn. So before he can rescue Lissa, he has to go on a quest to get a singular weapon, and it harkens very much back to King Arthur's Excalibur. It is called the glaive. And if you've heard of Krull before and haven't seen the movie, you probably know about the glaive. It's this like gigantic throwing star looking thing that's all gold and has blades that come out of it. It's really one of the best things about the movie, and it was used in all the marketing and everything like that. So on his way to rescue the princess, he retrieves, the glaive, and then he runs into a bunch of allies, and they have to go through a bunch of trials. If this sounds familiar from the hero's journey, it's pretty textbook. And then they need to basically go on a different quest to find the location of the Black Fortress, because they know that's where Lissa's being held. And they then they're able to find the location, they infiltrate the Black Fortress, confront the Beast, good guys win, etc. That is the plot of Krull in a nutshell. So why did I mention all those other movies in the intro, all those other stories? Because Krull takes aspects or forecasts aspects of all of them, right? So in 1980, when they started production on Krull, basically the guys from Columbia gave marching orders to people to go, hey, we need to make this big kind of swashbuckling space adventure fairy tale thing. And that is exactly what they went off and tried to do. It is, when you watch the film, you will see parts that jump out at you as coming from Excalibur or coming from Errol Flynn and Tyrone Power swashbuckling films. Or from Clash of the Titans, or from Jason and the Argonauts, or from Lord of the Rings, and definitely from Star Wars, because you got to remember, this is 1980 when they're starting to develop this. The A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back were out. So everybody is trying to copy this. On top of that, there were a slew of sword and sorcery kind of fantasy, space opera-ish kind of movies that were coming out, like Battle Beyond the Stars and The Sword and the Sorcerer, Hawk the Slayer, the Beastmaster, Conan the Barbarian. There's an abundance of these films that are coming out, and some of them are doing well, and some of them are pretty schlocky and are really MST3K material when we look back on it now. And Krull, I guess there is a riff tracks for Krull, and I really have to go and seek it out and watch the movie, because I think it would probably be gold. But I'm remiss, and I haven't done that yet. And one of the things that I think hurts Krull because it comes up. There's some great little gems, nuggets of really, really just great storytelling in this. And you can't fault the cast. The cast was really good. Lissa was great. Unfortunately, she's a British actress, and the studio felt that the film would do better with an American accent, which I guess she couldn't do convincingly. So they redubbed all her lines. So the voice of Lissa that you actually hear in the film is not the actress at all, which is kind of messed up. And they kind of missed the mark on there, because I don't even think it would have affected anybody. But studio execs are second guessing a lot of stuff, just try to eke out all the money. And one of the reasons I think it's kind of the last stand of the old guard is when you watch this, there are a lot of tropes that they know work in these kind of movies. And like, what am I talking about? Well, you'll see swashbuckling, right? The hero, Colwyn, is very much kind of a Robin Hood figure. And I don't mean that in a steals from the rich, gives to the poor kind of thing. I mean his dress. The pants this guy is wearing are skin tight. They might as well be tights. And the actor that plays Colwyn looks like he could fit right in, like with Errol Flynn and Tyrone Power, and you probably wouldn't even notice. Like he looks exactly perfect for those kind of movies until Orlando Bloom rolls along in Pirates of the Caribbean, and then you're just like, whoa, okay. But he very much has that kind of flair, that kind of dashing, and it's tragic that I guess his career didn't really take off after Krull, because Krull notoriously bombed, and it cost a lot back in 1983. It cost like $30 million to make, and it had for the time, somewhat decent effects, and I'm cutting it a lot of slack, because when I rewatched it, I was like, man, these effects look really, really dated. Like, but the Dark Crystal has similar effects, stuff like that. So I was like, oh, maybe it was just 1983 that the effects were. But then I'm thinking, no, this is after Dragon Slayer, and sadly for Krull, the movie that was in theaters when it got released was Return of the Jedi, and I'm like, oh, that doesn't jive. It's like Return of the Jedi had outstanding effects that hold up to this day. So it's like, why does Krull look the way it is when it had about the same budget as Return of the Jedi? So it bombed colossally. It made I think $16 million back at the box office. But it has this little place in people's imaginations that saw it that summer and who have seen it since. It is very much, it's closer. You can see where they kind of interfered with it or tried to mess with it to try to make it more like Star Wars. And my guess is this was not originally put into the original film. Like that wasn't a concept of the original film, but that as production went on, they were like, well, you got to have lasers. You got to have laser swords. They don't have laser swords. They have lightning swords in Krull. But you can kind of see that it was like, okay, we need to add this stuff to get folks to come and see the visual, the visual effects are what it's all about. There's some effects that forecast other things. There is a magician that's comic relief in it, named Ergo, right? And his whole trick is that he changes into different animals. Now, of course, when you see this in Krull, you're just like, well, this is exactly what shows up in Willow later on. You know what I mean? So it's just a kind of a primitive effect at the time because they didn't have morphing yet. So it works to tell the story, and it's reminiscent of somewhat of the Harryhausen Sinbad films and stuff like that. Speaking of that, there is a sequence, my favorite sequence in the film, is when Ynir goes to meet the Widow of the Web. And he needs to do this because he needs to find where the fortress is going to be. And that entire sequence is just amazing. There's some great stop motion of this like crystal spider on the web that's like moving around and everything like that. And we'll come back to talk about that sequence because it's one of the really cool storytelling gems about Krull. As far as like the tropes that show up in Krull, to get back to that, you got heroes swinging from ropes during a sword fight, just like Errol Flynn and everything like that. With a sweeping score behind it. You've got, of course, rescuing princesses. That's a trope as old as time. Quicksand being a kind of a big problem. They spend a lot of time on that actually. Spikes coming out of walls closing in on people, giant spiders. So there's a lot more. I'm just kind of just glossing over it. And it has, like I said, it has just so much potential, but it gets mired in tropes. They're almost using them as a crutch, which a lot of time that's the purpose of tropes sometimes, is when you just need to shorthand the audience that, hey, here's the way things are. We understand who the Guardian character is. We understand who the heralds are. We understand how the allies are going to work out and everything. So if you stick to those tropes, you can save a lot of storytelling time, but it also kind of hurts your story because the audience already knows the quicksand trope, right? Which again shows up in a variance in the Neverending Story with the Swamp of Sadness. These movies are all mining the same. They're all mining the same material, so they share the DNA. There are some very weird things about Krull. The film relies very heavily on exposition. You get a feeling that there are a million ideas and they don't have time to tell you or explore any of them. So they just kind of briefly throw lines away and stuff like that and talk about things. And one of the coolest concepts of Krull that I would kind of really want to revisit is there's a race called the Cyclops. And the Cyclops in Krull are apparently not from there. They're another race of extraterrestrials, and their race had made a pact with the Beast because he's that powerful. And they had asked for the ability to see the future. And the Beast kind of betrayed them and gave them the ability to see the future, but the only moment they can see is the moment of their death. And it's kind of confusing because they can kind of change the moment of their death. But if they do, it's always going to be worse off for them. It's going to cause them great, great pain. Now, everything I just told you is summed up in about 2 lines in the entire movie. It's like they really count on you to just like extrapolate stuff from 2 lines of dialogue. And the 2 lines of dialogue are not together, by the way. The part about the whole them being able to see the future is told fairly early on in the film, and then the part about if they change their deaths, it'll cause them great pain is told towards the end of the film. So what makes that kind of cool is that because the Cyclops knows the time of their death, they can wade into battle knowing that they're not going to die there and fight with just, ferocity that normal people would not do because you're worried about getting killed. Unfortunately, in the execution of the film, I don't think it lives up to that promise of that idea. And part of the reason is they have an actor that's a big dude wearing a lot of prosthetics, and it would have been hard for him to fight realistically in these things. And on top of that, he is fighting these guys called Slayers. Those are the Beast's kind of stormtroopers, and they are wearing this like high-tech kind of armor. An interesting aside is that every time a Slayer dies, they make a point of showing this like electricity come out, and then the Slayer's head will crack open, and this creature, kind of a slug slime kind of thing, will pour out of the Slayer's helmet, and burrow itself into the ground, like no matter where they are. And that's never explained. Like if the Slayers are actual like creatures in and of themselves, or if they're being piloted by these little slug things and they're kind of, mecha or something. They never really explain that. And it's surprisingly easy to kill these Slayers despite all the armor and everything, but that's a standard trope too. I mean, the Stormtrooper armor doesn't stop anything in Star Wars. So, an interesting aside I just thought of. In the episode of Rick and Morty with the train, the story train, right? I don't remember the actual name of that episode, but it's the 4th season episode, and it's an episode of Rick and Morty with the train. There is one guy at the beginning who is telling the first kind of anthology flashback story about why he wants Rick dead. And all of his servants are actually Slayers from Krull. It was just like this little Easter egg that Harmon threw in there that I was like, really? So it was really, really funny. And a lot of different shows have referenced Krull throughout, most noticeably too. I think the glaive shows up at the end of Ready Player One. I know that it is kind of mentioned. It is mentioned several times in the film too. So it does hold a special place for people. I'm trying to think of what I was getting at before I got diverted to Rick and Morty. Oh yeah, the Cyclops, right? So the Cyclops doesn't wind up, fulfilling that promise or that potential again, right? Of seeing this kind of creature that would know the moment of its death, and so therefore can just cut loose in battle because he's just like, well, this is not the day I die, so I can just go off, right? And then I think it would be a lot more dramatic at that point when they start relying, if they started relying on the Cyclops to kind of bail him out of all these little combat scenarios, and then one time, the Cyclops doesn't. And they're like, what's going on? And, it's like, we can get away. Come on. And he's like, no, we can't. That would be really, really cool because that was the moment. Right. And then, I wanted to talk about the other story, kind of plot point hook that really, really struck me. It struck me as a kid, and it struck me, even more upon the rewatch because I was like, man, this is a really great concept they should explore further. And it's when Ynir, who is kind of the guardian figure, has to go find he has to go speak to the widow of the web, and she's kind of a mystical figure, and they describe that anybody who goes to visit the widow never leaves. Like you're never allowed to leave. You die at the web. And so he goes there because, and this is one of the things where Krull, I think, suffers in the story, is that there's always kind of another way to achieve a goal. And that's absolutely true. There are multiple ways to achieve a goal. So why would I see that as a negative? Well, because in like fantasy stories and in Krull, they will say things like, hey, this is the only way. Right, we need to go talk to this guy, to the seer, and he's going to give us where the Black Fortress is going to materialize, and it's the only way. Only when these things like fall apart, which is great, right? Great setbacks. There's a whole sequence that's really, really cool with the doppelganger, changeling, and everything that's kind of really creepy for kids. And but then there's when they achieve a setback, they're just like, oh, well, we'll also do this. This was another way too. Now, usually the other way to accomplish it is worse, which is why they didn't try it the first time. But it's just kind of like they tell you things like this is the only way to do it. And then it turns out it's not the only way to do it. So it's just kind of funny there. But anyway, that's what leads Ynir to go to the widow of the web. And there's some great concepts. There's all kinds of stuff I could get into between Ynir and the widow, whose name is also Lissa. And on when I was on Dungeon Crawlers, we were talking about how a fan theory that Ynir and Lissa were actually the original people spoken of in the prophecy, but they weren't able to fulfill it. And I love that whole idea. But that would lead us down a whole other rabbit hole, and in the interest of time, we're not going to explore that right now. So what happens is Ynir goes and he's able to negotiate with the Widow of the Web, but then she pours she's basically you can't stop time, and she grants him passage to get out of the web, but it's going to cost him his life anyway. And so she pours these hourglass sands into his hands, and he's trying to make it back to the camp where the rest of the party is waiting to pass on the information that he has, because he does have the information about where the Black Fortress is going to materialize. And so he comes out of the web, and the entire time, sand is passing through his fingers. And when she first pours the sand into his hands, he answers, "I can't stop the sand." And she's like, "Nope, you can't stop time." And she's like, "When the sand runs out, so will you." So he's trying to get back, and he's somewhat far from them. So when he gets there, he basically doesn't even make it back to the camp. He makes it to the periphery of the camp and then shouts the location of the Black Fortress, and then dies. And I thought, wow, that is really, really cool bit of storytelling. Of course, our heroes make it in, and they, attack and defeat the beast and all this stuff with the glaive. And it's a lot of fun, but I just kind of wanted to revisit, Krull and why it means so much to a lot of people. And one of the things I did want to talk about in a very positive manner is the score by James Horner. Now, this is one of his earliest scores. He had done some other stuff. He'd done Battle Beyond the Stars. He had done Star Trek II. And when you listen to Krull, there are cues deliberately from Star Trek II seeded throughout the film. It's very, very obvious when you hear it. But you will also hear cues from Aliens, from The Mask of Zorro, from The Abyss, all in Krull. And they're kind of prototypes for what those scores are going to become in the future. So that's really, really cool. And it's upon the rewatch, I didn't really remember the score from my days of watching it as a kid. But on the rewatch, I was like, oh, this is amazing. This is Enterprise leaving the space dock. This is Enterprise and Reliant. This is the Motara Nebula. That's from Aliens. This is the Abyss. This is, and you can just pick out little cues that show up in other scores. And it was just, it's a nice little kind of Easter egg when you're revisiting the film. So if you've never, ever seen Krull, I really, I would caution you that the film is dated. It's 37 years old now. And it was very, very tropey even when it came out. So just be aware of that and kind of be prepared to take it what it is. I would recommend, however, if you want to write fantasy or sword and sorcery or that kind of space opera kind of story, Krull is kind of on a mandatory watch list, because you should watch it and kind of study the story to see where it made certain missteps. And why I kind of started this by saying it had potential or possibilities is because if any film or franchise deserved a remake modern day, it's Krull. And there are little seeds of things that happen in the film. When at the very beginning, when Lyssa and Colwyn are getting married and the Slayers attack the castle, they separate each other, right? They, and Colwyn gives a very kind of getaway, I'll fight and we can, I need you to be safe. Go and run and hide. And Lyssa's answer is atypical for a 1980s fantasy film. She answers, "No, we'll fight them together." We never get to see that. She runs off and hides. When her guards that are escorting her get ambushed by Slayers, Lyssa does two things that are really cool. One, she draws a sword that they're passing through an armory. She grabs a sword and tosses it to one of her guards who's fighting a Slayer, right? but then she draws a sword herself. And we never get to see, the next time that we see Lissa, she's already captured and being led away by the Slayers and calling for Colwyn for help. In a modern remake, we would get to see her fight, and that would be really, really cool. There's obviously the visual effects would be top notch. The other thing that I would recommend that they would change is that in the original film, Colwyn gets the glaive entirely too soon. He gets it really early, and when you see what the glaive can do in the third act of the film, you're like, dude, why haven't you been using this the whole time? It's literally like if he got the lightsaber and never used it until like the very first time you see him turn on a lightsaber is when he's fighting Darth Vader. So it's kind of like, okay, you gave it to him too early because he's had this thing, and when he goes to use it, without explanation, the old one, the Guardian, says, no, don't use it. Save it for when the time is right. And he's like, well, how will I know the time is right? And the cliched answer comes back, you'll know. So when you do see him use the glaive, you're like, you should have been using that the whole movie, and it would be kind of cool to see more of the glaive, and it's amazing. It's a really, really cool fantasy weapon. It returns to him. Which has shades of, Tron's disc, where he can hurl this disc and it just atomizes people and then comes back. Only the glaive is like 10 times cooler than Tron's disc. It's way awesome. So I would really recommend to try to find the novelization. You can find them on eBay. You can't, it's long out of print. But find the novelization, read that first, and then watch the movie. If you can't find the novelization, you can rent the movie. You can find it on a bunch of the different streaming services. But just know going into it, you're going into kind of an antiquated 1980s 37-year-old movie with really dated visual effects, but the potential is there. And the ideal way I would like to see it would be like if Netflix picked it up and did like a 6-episode like miniseries of Krull, right? Because then you could just explore all these. It has 1,000 different ideas in it, and they're unable to kind of pull it off, and they waste time instead of kind of pulling that stuff off and exploring these new ideas. They waste time doing like quicksand sequences. And there's also kind of like a mercurial aspect to the film. Like it almost doesn't know if it really wants to be dark or if it wants to be kind of more of a fairy tale light kind of film. It is definitely a children's movie. And I think when it came out as PG, and I think overseas it was rated G. So that gives you kind of an idea of kind of what you're going into. But Colwyn plays very, very like a Luke Skywalker kind of character when maybe he should have been Han Solo. And, I'd be remiss saying that when he meets up with some of his, quote unquote, merry men, because that scene is, it's almost Robin Hood, The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood, 1939 with Errol Flynn. When he meets these guys that are going to help him on his quest, you'll note an extremely young Liam Neeson is there, and Robbie Coltrane is also there. And Robbie Coltrane, if you don't know that name, that's most of you would probably know him as Hagrid from the Harry Potter films. He's a British actor and comedian, been around a long time. Of course, everybody knows who Liam Neeson is. So it's just kind of a neat thing. And I know I've been a little bit overly critical of Krull, but I really adore the film. And when I was growing up, there were 2 prop replicas that I really, really, really wanted. And It was Bubo the Owl from Clash of the Titans and the Glaive from Krull. And I've never been able to find a satisfying replica of the Glaive. It's like one of these nebulous things. I found a passable one of Bubo, but the Glaive still eludes me. So anyway, I wanted to get this out before the 37th anniversary of Krull, and go check it out one night. It's interesting. If anything, if you're DMing or whatever, you can steal some tropes from it, and maybe your party won't be familiar with it, and they'll think you're a genius. So that's all I have right now. Mike out. You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are brought to you by The Fat Rat. The song you are hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brehm. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.